Welcome back. If you're looking to get a handle on complex topics, get the key info without wading through tons of stuff, well, that's what we do here.
Exactly.
And today we're taking a deep dive into a really compelling and often pretty dark chapter in Philadelphia's history. We're talking about the Philadelphia Black Mafia.
Right. We've pulled together, various sources, historical accounts, articles, that sort of thing to really unpack this.
And we're focusing mainly on their period of significant influence, would you say? Roughly late 60s to early 90s.
Yeah, that's the core period. Late 1960s through maybe the early 1990s. That's when they really emerged and held sway.
So our mission today is pretty clear.
Yeah.
We want to understand how this group started, how they grew from a neighborhood collective in South Philly into a major crime syndicate.
What their operations look like, the kind of crimes they were involved in.
Right, and also what led to their eventual fracturing, and importantly, the lasting impact they had on the city.
Definitely. It's a story with a long shadow.
Okay, let's get into it then. Where does this story begin?
The origins. It really starts around 1969, and the central figure, initially anyway, was Samuel Christian. He later took the name Suleiman Bey.
Ah, after converting to Islam.
Exactly, within the Nation of Islam. And their base, their starting point, was Point Breeze in South Philadelphia.
And what were they doing initially? Just small-time stuff?
Pretty much, yeah. Holding up local crap games, getting into the drug trade, the kind of activities you might see before a group really consolidates power.
Right. A fairly typical starting point for organized crime, it seems.
Right.
But it sounds like it didn't stay local for very long.
No, not at all. By the early 70s, they were really starting to solidify their control, expanding pretty rapidly.
Where to? Still Philly or beyond?
Throughout African-American neighborhoods, definitely in Philadelphia, but also across the Delaware Valley. So you're talking South Jersey, Atlantic City, Camden were key spots, but also Wilmington, Delaware, and Chester, Pennsylvania.
So quite a reach.
A significant reach, yeah. They went from those smaller kind of local hustles to being a major syndicate controlling a big chunk of the criminal activity in those areas.
And they picked up a few different names along the way?
They did, most commonly Philadelphia Black Mafia, or PBM, but also, because of the Nation of Islam connection, they were called the Black Muslim Mafia, or sometimes just the Muslim Mob.
Reflecting the membership.
Exactly. Largely African-American, and a lot of members did convert and become practicing Muslims. Now, estimates on size are tricky, but later on, during the Junior Black Mafia era in the early 90s, figures suggested maybe 100 core members and perhaps 300 associates.
Let's dig into those early figures a bit more. You mentioned Samuel Christian, Suleiman Bey. What was his background? What made him stand out?
Well, he was apparently quite a presence. Former Black Panther, had a pretty extensive arrest record already. Physically imposing, described as 5'10", powerfully built. Some sources even called him a thick-necked bully.
Sounds like someone who could command respect or fear.
Definitely projected that kind of image. And he wasn't alone. There were other key founders, names that come up repeatedly. Ronald Harvey, Henry Dabney, Richard Porkchops James.
Pork chops, okay.
Yeah. Donald Donnie Day, Clyde Apples Ross, Robert Bop Daddy Fairbanks, Craig Heist Jones, Walter Hudgens, and Robert Nudie Mims. That was the core group, really shaping things early on.
And that Nation of Islam link you mentioned, how significant was that in their identity and operations?
It was huge. The conversion of so many members was a defining feature. That's where the Muslim Mafia nickname really came from. It's quite a striking mix, religious affiliation intertwined with serious criminal enterprise.
Did the Nation of Islam leadership condone this?
Well, that's where it gets complicated. Some members definitely used the NOI affiliation, maybe as a shield or to gain legitimacy or influence in certain communities. But the national leadership, particularly in Chicago, often tried to distance themselves. They were understandably concerned about their reputation, these gangster mosques, as some called them.
I can imagine. And that whole situation must have made things tough for law enforcement, especially early on.
Oh, absolutely. One of the biggest hurdles for the police was just getting people to talk. There was a palpable fear of retaliation from the Black Mafia.
That's a wall of silence.
Pretty much. Made investigations incredibly difficult. And their activities were expanding, too. It wasn't just drugs. They moved into extorting other drug dealers, running numbers operations, setting up illegitimate businesses as fronts.
Taking over entire rackets.
Eventually, yes, gaining control over things like illegal gambling, loan sharking. And with that control came a degree of political influence in some areas, too.
The sources mention estimates of over 40 murders attributed to them. That's a staggering number.
It really is, and that's probably a conservative estimate. What's also striking is you look at the arrest records of these founders, often for violent crimes, and how often cases just got dropped.
Because witnesses wouldn't testify.
Exactly, lack of cooperation. And that just built this reputation, this aura of being untouchable, which of course only made them stronger on the streets.
There's an interesting point raised in some accounts about the potential negative impact on legitimate black businesses in Philly around that time.
Yeah, it's a nuanced but important point. As segregation was easing up, there was this potential moment for black entrepreneurship and capital to really grow in Philadelphia.
But the Black Mafia's presence interfered.
The argument is that their activities, the extortion, the violence, their dominance in certain underground economies, created an environment that actually discouraged legitimate investment. It might have stifled the growth of lawful black businesses, maybe even pushed capital out of those communities, a kind of unintended or perhaps intended consequence.
A sobering thought. Let's shift gears a bit. How did they interact with the established traditional organized crime, like the Italian Mafia in Philly?
Ah, that's a fascinating dynamic. So you had Angelo Bruno running the Philadelphia family at the time. Officially, he discouraged his guys from dealing drugs, especially heroin, within South Philly.
Officially.
Right. But the reality was more complex. He couldn't entirely prevent deals happening, especially with New York families like the Gambinos, who are involved in the drug trade. And those connections sometimes involved the group that became the Black Mafia.
So, direct dealings.
It seems the Black Mafia found a major supplier early on in Frank Matthews, who was a huge black drug kingpin based in New York. But Bruno, well, he seems to have adopted a sort of blind eye policy towards his own guys dealing with or supplying the Black Mafia.
As long as the money flowed right.
Pretty much. As long as the financial arrangements, the tributes were met, likely payments going up to him and maybe back to the New York families, he seemed willing to let it happen.
Did this lead to any kind of territorial understanding?
It appears so, yeah. An informal one, at least in South Philadelphia. Generally, Italian organized crime operated east of Broad Street, and the Black Mafia controlled things west of Broad Street.
And that division had consequences.
It did. Some sources suggest this kind of underworld partitioning actually hampered urban renewal efforts in those parts of the city, made development more difficult, more complicated.
It wasn't just external conflict either. There was violence within the group early on, right?
Yeah.
Like the murder of one of the founders.
Yes, Nathaniel Rock and Roll Williams. He was killed back in April 1969. The police called it a Black Mafia execution.
Why? What happened?
The story is he allegedly set up a robbery of his own high-stakes crap game, which several Black Mafia leaders were actually playing in. Suspicion fell on him pretty quickly.
And they dealt with it internally.
Seems that way. Witnesses saw him being taken away at gunpoint. His body turned up later, shot multiple times in the back. Classic mob-style hit.
Was anyone convicted for that?
Someone was arrested, Jerome Barnes, but the charges were eventually dropped. Same old story. Lack of witness cooperation. It really set a pattern, showed how hard it would be to prosecute these guys.
And there was another early incident, the beating of a state official.
Right, May 1969. David Truly, who was a deputy insurance commissioner for Pennsylvania, was investigating an insurance fraud scheme. He got brutally beaten with a lead pipe.
By whom?
Richard Porkchops, James, one of the founders we mentioned. Apparently, it was ordered by someone else involved in the scheme. Truly was severely injured.
What happened, James?
It gets murky. James was later arrested in New York for a different murder, supposedly a contract killing ordered by another figure, Eugene Bo Baines. But then James died in jail. Officially, a drug overdose.
But suspicious.
Very. Camden Police Intelligence suggested it might have been a hot shot, a deliberate overdose administered by other Black Mafia members to silence him, keep him from talking.
Wow. Okay, moving into the early 70s, things seemed to escalate. The Dubrow furniture store robbery in 71 sounds particularly brutal.
Oh, it was horrific. January 4th, 1971. 8 Black Mafia members went into Dubrow's on South Street, initially pretending to be customers.
Yeah.
Then they pulled guns. They tied up 13 employees, beat them severely, shot 2 others. A janitor who just happened to walk in during the robbery was killed outright.
And it got worse.
Unbelievably, yes. They doused one employee with gasoline and set him on fire. Looted the place, then deliberately set more fires to destroy evidence. Witnesses even reported them trampling over a victim as they fled.
Just unimaginable cruelty.
The police commissioner at the time, Frank Rizzo, called it the most vicious crime I have ever come across. It shocked the city. Its impact was so huge, it actually became the basis for a novel later on, W.E.B. Griffin's The Witness.
That level of violence is hard to comprehend. And they weren't just targeting businesses, right? Other figures in the underworld, too, like Tyrone Palmer.
Exactly. Tyrone Mr. Millionaire Palmer. He was a big-time cocaine and heroin dealer, had strong connections in New York.
What happened to him?
Assassinated. Easter Sunday, 1972, down in Atlantic City at the Club Harlem, Samuel Christian himself walked up and shot Palmer in the face, in front of hundreds of witnesses.
In public like that.
Bold doesn't even cover it. When Palmer's bodyguards tried to react, other Black Mafia members opened fire into the crowd. Chaos ensued. Around 20 bystanders were wounded.
And anyone else killed?
Tragically, yes. 3 women who were just there caught in the crossfire, and one of Palmer's bodyguards died as well. Just a massacre.
But maybe the most infamous act, the one that really brought them national notoriety, was the Hanafi Muslim massacre in '73.
Without a doubt. That was January 18th, 1973, in Washington, D.C., though the killers were linked back to Philadelphia.
What happened there?
7 Sunni Muslims were murdered in a house associated with Hamas Abdul Khalis. 2 adults and 5 children, aged from 9 days to 10 years old. Some were shot, others drowned. Just absolute brutality.
And the motive?
It stemmed from Khalil's public criticism of Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. Khalil had written letters accusing some NOI members of being gangsters and deviating from true Islam. The murders were seen as retaliation, ordered from within circles connected to the NOI, allegedly carried out by Black Mafia members from Philly.
Was anyone brought to justice for that?
Eventually, yes, several men linked to the Philadelphia mosque were convicted. But the difficulty in the investigation and the sheer horror of it deeply affected Khalil. It's seen as a major factor leading him to orchestrate the Hanafi siege in D.C. 4 years later, in 1977, trying to force attention onto his family's murders.
It's just chilling, these acts.
Yeah.
They define the group's reputation for ruthlessness. But let's talk about structure. It wasn't just random violence, was it? There was some organization behind it all.
Oh, definitely. They weren't just a loose street gang. They had formalized meetings. They even set up legal nonprofit organizations, ostensibly for community work, but really acting as fronts.
And a hierarchy.
Yes, there was a hierarchy. They used terms like Part I for, sort of, full members or key associates, and the little brothers for younger guys or those lower down the ranks. A clear chain of command, at least initially. You had to meet certain criteria to move up.
What about their meetings? Were they secretive?
Extremely. Meetings happened at various locations, often kept secret even from lower-level members. Get this. Sometimes members would be blindfolded when being transported to and from meetings by higher-ups.
Blindfolded. Seriously?
Yeah, precisely so. They wouldn't know the location if they were ever caught or decided to talk. They had strict rules at these meetings, too. Everyone searched on entry. Only the person presiding over the meeting decided who could be armed.
Sounds like something out of a movie. Did they have oaths or codes?
They did. A mandatory secrecy oath. You swore not to divulge sensitive information. And it wasn't just about keeping quiet yourself. You were obligated to report anyone else you saw violating the oath. The implication was clear. Break the oath. And not just you, but maybe your family or others could be at risk.
Classic organized crime tactics. You mentioned community projects as fronts.
Right. They set up things like Black Bee Inc. The stated goal was often something positive, like ending gang violence in the Black community.
But that was just cover.
Largely, yes. The irony was thick because many people, including law enforcement, knew the Black Mafia itself was behind a lot of the very violence they claimed they wanted to stop.
And their connection to certain Nation of Islam mosques persisted.
It did, though it remained complex. Certain local mosques, like one in West Philadelphia led by Jeremiah Pugh, who became Jeremiah Shabazz, became known for having prominent Black Mafia figures as members.
And the national leadership wasn't happy.
No, the leadership in Chicago reportedly worried about the negative press, the perception of these places as gangster mosques. Later on, an FBI investigation focused on Shamsuddin Ali, who took over from Shabazz as imam at that mosque.
What did that uncover?
Allegations of extortion and really significant connections reaching into the administration of then-Mayor John F. Street. It highlighted how deep the political corruption aspect went.
Did Street face charges?
No, Mayor Street himself wasn't prosecuted, but several of his close associates were convicted on federal charges stemming from that investigation. It really shows how intertwined things had become by then.
Okay, so they had this period of intense power and influence, but things started to shift by the mid-'70s. The original group began to fracture.
Yeah, that's right. Increased pressure from law enforcement was a big part of it. The media was also paying more attention. The Philadelphia Inquirer, for instance, ran exposés really detailing the Black Mafia as a structured criminal syndicate.
And there were major arrests.
Yes, September 1974 was a key moment. A big federal raid involving drug agents and the Justice Department's strike force netted 21 members and affiliates. That didn't completely dismantle them, but it definitely marked the beginning of a fracturing period.
Did they just disappear then?
Not exactly. Some sources suggest the Black Mafia didn't so much disappear as morph. It fractured, reformed, maybe became less centralized, more agile, harder to pin down, and paradoxically, perhaps even increased its political influence in some ways during this period.
You also mentioned an informant, a community activist.
Right, Charles Robinson. He was involved with a community group that received government grants, but it had become heavily influenced, perhaps infiltrated by Black Mafia members.
And he started talking.
Apparently so. The story goes he feared for his family because of intimidation from a Black Mafia member who was actually his brother-in-law, James Fox. And he was likely also worried about investigations into how that grant money was being used. Wiretaps based on his information reportedly led to charges against numerous individuals.
That must have taken incredible courage or desperation.
Absolutely, especially given the Black Mafia's reputation for dealing with informants.
Which ties into that whole stop snitching culture that people associate with Philadelphia. Is the Black Mafia seen as a root cause of that?
It's often cited as a major factor, yes. Their effectiveness in silencing potential witnesses through extreme violence and intimidation created this deep-seated fear, this reluctance to cooperate with authorities that has unfortunately persisted in some communities for decades.
Made wiretaps almost essential for law enforcement.
For many years, yes, it was one of the few ways to build cases when witnesses were too scared to come forward publicly.
There was also suspicion around the murder of Teddy Pendergrass's manager.
Yes, Tasmaya Taslang. She was his manager and also his girlfriend, murdered in 1976. It remains unsolved, but the Black Mafia has long been suspected.
What was the supposed motive?
Resentment, allegedly. They didn't like her controlling access to Pendergrass and his increasingly lucrative career. They wanted a piece of the action or perhaps just more control.
So the original Black Mafia's main operational period kind of winds down by the mid-'80s, around 1984.
That's the general timeline, yeah. The intense pressure, the internal conflicts, the changing dynamics. It led to a decline of that original structure. But crucially, it wasn't the end of the story.
Because something new emerged.
Exactly. Around 1985, you see the formation of the Junior Black Mafia, the JBM, sometimes called the Young Black Mafia.
And were original members involved in setting this up?
Yes, some original Black Mafia figures played a role in organizing these younger guys. Part of the impetus was actually competition.
Competition from whom?
Jamaican posses, primarily from New York. They had moved into Philly and quickly taken over large parts of the drug distribution network, especially crack cocaine, in Black neighborhoods. The JBM was partly a response to that, an attempt to reclaim control.
And the JBM quickly became violent, too.
Extremely violent. By 1989, just a few years after forming, they were already linked to around 25 murders. They operated across various parts of the city.
How long did the JBM last?
Their main run was relatively short compared to the original PBM. They largely disbanded or faded by about 1992.
So what defined the JBM? How were they similar to or different from the original group?
Well, they definitely modeled themselves on the originals and even on La Cosa Nostra in terms of using violence and extortion to dominate the drug trade. But they also had elements of the street gangs many of them came from.
Membership, structure.
Membership was exclusively young Black men. Women were generally in support roles, not leadership. They even had their own insignia, these gold rings with JBM spelled out in diamonds.
Very flashy. Sounds like they're really a product of the crack epidemic era.
Absolutely. Conceived around 86, really born in 87, their primary focus was exploiting the huge profits from the crack market.
Who are the key players in the JBM?
Three main founders who grew up together in West Philly: Aaron Jones, Mark Casey, and Leonard Patterson. Aaron Jones was apparently obsessed with the Godfather movie, saw himself in that role. Casey was considered maybe the brains, and Patterson supposedly came up with the JBM name and the idea for the rings.
How did they build the organization?
They recruited friends, associates, people who already had their own drug crews operating in different sections of Philly. Sometimes it was voluntary, join us for bigger profits, more protection. Other times it involved persuasion through violence and intimidation.
Trying to create a unified structure.
Yeah, they attempted to bring these disparate crews under one JBM umbrella. They formed a sort of board of commissioners, with Aaron Jones quickly emerging as the de facto chairman, the top guy.
What did you need to join?
The main criteria seemed to be having an established drug network that could move significant weight. It wasn't just about individual muscle, it was about controlling territory and distribution.
Did the older Black Mafia guys mentor them?
Yes, that connection was there. Original PBM members provided advice, guidance, maybe connections. Interestingly, when Samuel Christian got out of prison, he apparently tried to take control of the JBM, but they resisted. They saw themselves as the new generation.
Did the JBM have links with the Italian mob too?
Yes, they did develop some connections there. A JBM advisor reportedly used LCN contacts to source drugs. JBM members were seen meeting with LCN associates, even hanging out at known mob spots. One guy was even spotted with Joey Merlino at sporting events.
Shows how those underworlds can overlap, regardless of ethnicity.
Definitely. Business is business sometimes.
So the JBM, even with a shorter run, they were a major player.
For that period, absolutely. Around 100 members, maybe 300 associates, they aggressively targeted independent dealers trying to force them into the JBM. Refusal could be fatal.
And they were involved beyond Philly.
They played a role in distribution for larger international drug cartels. And they had their own turf wars, most notably a violent conflict with the Jamaican Shower Posse in southwest Philly over drug territory.
What happened to the JBM leaders? Like Aaron Jones.
Aaron Jones is currently on death row. There's always talk, rumors about who might try to step into any perceived leadership vacuum, sometimes names connected back to the original family's surface.
It really helps to understand the scale of their impact by looking at the violence.
Yeah.
That list of murders. It's long, and the motives are often brutal.
It really paints a picture, doesn't it? We've mentioned some key ones, but just to reiterate the scope, Nathaniel Rock and Roll Williams killed for an alleged internal betrayal, Shane Albert, the janitor at Dubrows, Wardell Green, motive unclear, Velma Green, likely silenced as a witness.
Richard Harris and James Smith, a drug deal gone bad. Tyrone Palmer, the Atlantic City assassination. The 7 Hanafi Muslims in D.C. Major Coxon, reportedly over a drug debt.
Right. Charles Cooper and 2 women, a contract killing possibly linked to the NOI Black Mafia split. Hilton Stroud and Walter Tillman for intercepting a drug shipment. Thomas Farrington and George Abney, a turf dispute.
James Bubbles Price, killed after authorities spread a false rumor he was cooperating. Louis and Yetta Gruby, witnesses to the Dubrow robbery, eliminated years later. Barry Kelly, killed seemingly in retaliation for his father testifying. Frederick Armour, another territory dispute.
It's a grim catalog. Each name represents a life cut short, and countless others affected by the climate of fear and violence they created.
So wrapping up this deep dive, it's clear the Philadelphia Black Mafia and then the JBM cast a very long shadow over the city for decades.
Absolutely. Rapid rise, control over major criminal enterprises, extreme brutality as a tool, complex relationships with groups like the NOI and the Italian mob, and then this fragmentation and evolution into the JBM.
And the legacy, especially that stop snitching culture, is something Philadelphia has grappled with for a long time. Beyond that specific culture, though, what other lasting effects, maybe social or economic, do you think this era had?
That's a really important question to think about. I mean, the level of violence alone leaves deep scars on communities, trauma, distrust, that doesn't just vanish when the organization fades.
Right.
Economically, think about the impact of widespread drug dealing, extortion. It destabilizes neighborhoods, hinders legitimate business growth. And the political corruption angle we touched on, that erodes public trust in institutions, which can take generations to rebuild.
So the ripples spread out far beyond the actual criminal acts themselves.
Exactly. These aren't just crime stories. They're stories about communities, about power, about the long-term consequences of fear and corruption. You can probably still trace some of those effects today.
Really powerful points to consider. If this deep dive has piqued your interest, definitely check out the source materials or explore related aspects. There's always more to uncover.
For sure.
And maybe a final thought to leave folks with. Considering all the factors, the social conditions, the law enforcement challenges, the internal dynamics that allowed the Black Mafia to rise and operate for so long, what lessons can we take away about organized crime? And perhaps more importantly, what echoes of that era might still be felt today, not just in Philadelphia, but in other cities too? Something to chew on.